Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rumi Matamba, and I will be your host today. Tonight, during the day, depending on what time you have joined us, welcome to our panel on nuancing the conflict and crime nexus by looking at illicit economies that fuel conflict in West Africa. This session will revolve around understanding the relationship between illicit economies and instability, looking specifically at examples from West Africa. The relationship between illicit economies and instability is complex and nuanced. Some illicit economies, such as arms trafficking, cattle rustling, and kidnappings, have a particularly strong connection with instability, and as such have often been categorized as accelerant markets because they drive instability, and instability also fuels these illicit markets in return. Other illicit economies, on the other hand, while driving instability through financing of armed groups, for example, are also a source of livelihood for communities, including in fragile contexts where they provide a certain degree of stability. For example, we see this quite clearly through the artisanal gold mining markets, which provide an important example of this. So understanding this nuance between crime and conflict is particularly important. And today, within this session, we will be hearing new and granular data on the dynamics of illicit markets, such as kidnapping, cattle rustling, and artisanal gold mining in West Africa, focusing on the intersections with conflict actors, including violent extremist groups and bandits. During the panel, we will first get an introduction of the crime-conflict nexus before we look into example of these specific criminal markets. And so joining us today within this dynamic session, the three speakers that you see on your screen, and I will ask them to wave as I introduce them, starting with you, Liez Tagziria. Liez is a senior analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, working in the Observatory of Illicit Economies in West Africa. Liez has researched a wide range of illicit economies globally, and in particular has looked at the links between illicit economies and conflict, and hence why he has joined us today. He's the editor of the West Africa Risk Bulletin, which I highly encourage all of you to engage with if you have not looked at it before. And he was previously a senior member of the Global Initiative's flagship product, which is the Organized Crime Index. Secondly, we will be joined by Dr. Gideon Ofosu-Piesa. Gideon, if you could also just wave. Gideon is an analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. He specializes in a range of fields, including extractive governance, illicit financial flows, and gold supply chains in West Africa. His expertise extends to the study of organized crime in Ghana, and this is in addition to his proficiency in energy security as well as climate policy. He has served in various roles, which include serving as a steering committee member for the Media Coalition Against Illegal Mining, amongst other roles. And then thirdly, last but definitely not least, we'll be joined by El Haj Jite. El Haj, if you could also wave. El Haj has 12 years of experience in international development and peace building. He has worked with various state and non-state stakeholders, including the United States Department of State, and he is the founder and executive director of the Timbuktu Center for Strategic Studies on the Sahel. His research and writing explores good governance, political transitions, democracy, peace and security, as well as youth civic engagement. So we're looking forward to hearing from all of you today. And just without any further ado, I will open up the panel, and we will start with you, Liez.
Perfect, thank you. If we could have the slides up, please. Thank you very much. And if you could go next slide. and then one more. Perfect. So thank you very much. Thank you, Rumbi, and thanks for everyone for joining us on this panel. I'm sort of quite honoured to be able to speak with two colleagues and with whom I'm sharing the panel today who are experts in their field. And I'm really excited to be able to listen to what they have to say. I will start just by sort of giving an introduction to this, the sort of the concept of the crime conflict nexus in West Africa, and as Rumbi mentioned in her introduction, the sort of the concept of what these accelerant markets are. If you could go to the next slide, please, Maria. The violence in West Africa at the moment is at really at unprecedented levels. I mean, there's rampant insecurity at the hands of violent extremists, of other armed groups, and of criminal bandits and other sort of criminal actors. But in addition to conflict and instability, the region is also affected by a wide range of extremely pervasive and harmful, in a lot of cases, illicit economies. We recently published at the Global Initiative the 2023 Global Organized Crime Index, and that shows that almost every single criminal market has increased its reach over the past 2 years on the African continent broadly, from arms trafficking to the various drugs markets and environmental crime. And these two phenomena, so conflict and criminal markets, are inextricably linked. Not only do illicit economies act as a sort of a driver of conflict, they're a source of funding for conflict actors quite often, but conflict zones are major sort of enabling factors for criminal markets to flourish. So at the Global Initiative, we wanted to explore sort of the intersection between conflict and illicit economies. And so we undertook this project, which basically mapped all of the different hubs of illicit economies across the West Africa region, of which we identified 280, and you can see them on the map. But we also wanted to see which ones were most closely linked to conflict and instability. So we developed the Illicit Economies and Instability Monitor, which basically gives a score to each illicit hub based on the extent to which the illicit economies in the hub act as vectors of conflict and instability. So based on those scores, each hub is classified as low, medium, high, or very high. I think it's important to note here, just to reiterate, when we say high, it's not that there's high level of organized crime or even that there's a high level of conflict. What we're saying is that there is a high nexus between illicit economies and conflict and instability. So what this monitor does is it helps to identify areas where illicit markets play the most important role as vectors of instability, which allows policymakers to essentially to prioritize specific areas for very targeted action in response to illicit economies as part of a wider toolkit for stabilization. Next slide, please. Now, there's a lot that we can sort of pull from the illicit hub mapping findings, but I think among the most important ones is the sort of the finding relating to the different illicit economies that are present around West Africa region, and how the relationships with conflict and instability actually differs depending on which criminal market you're looking at. And what I mean by that is the prominence of certain illicit economies varies considerably across the monitor spectrum. So in other words, the criminal markets that are the most prominent in areas where the crime conflict nexus is high are quite different to the criminal markets that are most common in areas where the nexus is low. So for example, the cocaine trade, it's actually the illicit economy with the highest, or the sort of the biggest discrepancy in prevalence rate between lower and higher scoring hubs. It features far less in those hubs where the links between crime and conflict are assessed to be strong. To a degree, this is a feature of geography, because coastal hubs tend to be less affected by crime and conflict, and those coastal hubs are obviously important as import hubs for cocaine. So that's just one sort of example of an illicit economy where actually it seems that the link to conflict and instability is less strong. On the other hand, next slide, please, Maria. There are several illicit economies that are far more present in hubs scoring high on the monitor. And so arms trafficking is a pretty obvious example. It's actually twice as likely to feature as a major market in the high and the very high hubs. It actually features as a major market in more than half of all of the hubs in the high and the very high classification, but only 1 in 4 of the low and the medium hubs across West Africa. These findings sort of underscore our understanding of the arms market as an accelerant market, which plays, a market that plays an important role in fueling instability because it weaponizes existing tensions and conflicts, and sort of can also, escalate the use of violence as a way of controlling illicit markets by these criminal actors. Now, kidnap for ransom is also another illicit economy that features far more prominently in illicit hubs that are more significant vectors of crime and conflict. And I'll be discussing kidnap for ransom and other forms of kidnapping in the sort of a next section of this panel discussion. But another one is cattle rustling. Cattle rustling, my colleague on the panel, El Haj, is going to talk in detail about cattle rustling in the Sahel. But cattle rustling is similarly sort of disproportionately prevalent in those illicit hubs where the crime conflict nexus is high. So next slide, please. So to underscore the sort of the intersection between illicit economies and conflict, we identified the most conflict affected regions across West Africa, which we're called here on the slides high fatality regions, which are basically the regions or sort of, the states or département or whatever it is in the country that have experienced 500 or more conflict fatalities over the past decade. So basically where there is most, conflict and violence, right? And of the 280 illicit hubs that were identified across all of West Africa, 30% of them are located in these so-called high fatality regions. So that's a significant proportion, right? 30%. But actually, if you look at it from the other side of the coin, you really see the extent to which crime and conflict is linked, because what we found was that 43 of the 46 high fatality regions are home to at least one illicit hub. So basically what we show is that conflict settings almost always encompass some degree of illicit economy. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, and we're surely going to move on to looking at some of these accelerant markets in more detail. But I just wanted to touch on what lessons can we draw from these sort of high-level findings on the links between illicit economies and instability. Well, we found that not all criminal markets are equally responsible for or equal drivers of conflict. And often, actually, illicit economies can also be important livelihoods. And so disrupting those livelihoods, disrupting those illicit economies can lead to long-term consequences for essentially for the legitimacy of states, but also the legitimacy of alternative governance providers, which includes violent extremist groups and other forms of criminal groups that seek to provide a degree of public services and governance over communities. So that needs to be taken into account by policymakers. So when designing stabilization interventions, policymakers need to make sure that these interventions are are crime sensitive, that they're sensitive to the illicit economy dynamics in the areas in which they're seeking to intervene. Taking into account the different market typologies that are prevalent in the conflict zones that they're the conflict zones in question, as well as the role of these criminal markets in shaping instability and violence. And I think there's no more sort of worthy of analysis criminal market than cattle rustling and kidnapping and the gold sector, which we'll be looking into now. So that's it for me on this section, and I'll pass back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liaz. That was an important way to set the scene for us and the rest of the audience. And I have shared a link to the West Africa Illicit Mapping Hub if you would like to engage with it further and draw from what Liaz has just presented. A note to the audience today to please use the Q&A function to pose any questions that you may have to our panelists. We will not be allowing people to raise their hands and interject, but we will take comments, questions through the Q&A function, and we do want to make this panel as interactive as possible. So please do use the Q&A function for any comments or questions you may have. We are going to move over now and start looking from the context that has been set by Liaz to looking more specifically into some of the illicit markets that Liaz has just mentioned, starting with cattle rustling in the Sahel. And here El Haj GTA will present on cattle rustling in the Sahel. Over to you, El Haj.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rombi, for this, and thanks, Liaz, for your amazing presentation. So I'm El Haj GTA, founder and executive director of the Timbuktu Center for Strategic Studies on the Sahel. So I will talk about cattle rustling in the Sahel. I will focus in the central Sahel region of West Africa, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. But for the principal focus will be Mali, northern region area, Timbuktu, Gao, and the region of Menaka, where our studies took place. So in context, since 2012, Islamist militants linked to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula occupied northern region of Mali with the National Movement of Separation of the Liberation of Azawad, the MNLA. So from 2012 to now, we have seen a lot of growing, the rise of terrorist organizations, the rise of armed groups. What is important to know in that context is that in 2015, there was a fragile, peace led by French forces and international organizations like United Nations, and then they started a DDR process. But as you know, that DDR process was not successful. And then armed groups, terrorist groups who occupied northern region of Mali, particularly Gao, Timbuktu, and the region of Menaka have started an illicit economy, which is called now cattle rustling. So in this presentation, I will talk about cattle rustling, the impact and the link of cattle rustling into conflict and instability in Mali, in northern region of Mali. So who are the actors of cattle rustling? It's really important to know that we have two main actors here of cattle rustling in northern Mali. The first one are the armed groups movement, and the second one are jihadist groups. And then the small actors can be the drug traffickers and armed traffickers who are all linked to the cattle rustling. So it's really important to know that pastoralism is an important life of nomadic communities in northern Mali and in the rest of the Sahel region of West Africa. When we see the same dynamics can be applied to Burkina Faso, for example, when you see the border area Mali and Burkina Faso and the border area Mali, Niger, and Mali, Burkina Faso, the same actors evolve, whereby in those areas you have ethnic-based militias who control the communities, and you have in border area Mali, Burkina Faso, the Katiba Masina, who is a terrorist group who control that area. They are the one who are the actors of cattle rustling in the Sahel region of West Africa. Nearly, we have data from 2018 to 20, nearly a lot of cattle rustling activities happen in Mali, in West Africa. As said before, cattle rustling actors are really organized in a network, a criminal network. They are all linked to each other. And what we have observed during the studies, cattle rustling actors are linked to drug trafficking. They are linked to human trafficking. They are involved on irregular migrant smuggling from Timbuktu, Gao until Libya, and then to the Mediterranean Sea. Next slide, please. So actually, in this slide, we talk about the supply chain of cattle rustling in those areas, actors' role, and stolen livestock, itineraries. So during our study, what we really understand during the study is that, as you know, in Mali, there is a GDR process, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration process, which influence, member of different armed groups to look for, money in order to get a weapon, in order they should participate to the DDR process, which was difficult. So what they found is that most of young people who are member of armed groups or ethnic-based militia were entering in that network of cattle rustling so that they can get money and then buy weapon in order to participate to the GDR process in Mali. So in that chain, we can start by the chief rustlers. They are the one who are in charge, who are in charge to commit like the cattle rustling in different areas in northern Mali and in some parts of Central Sahel, like Mali and Burkina border area. Particularly when we talk about northern Mali, Timbuktu, Gao, and Menaka region. So those parts in the Sahel is where most of the greatest pastoralist communities live, in the so-called Gourma area, because of the graceland, because of the graceland, and then because of most of nomadic communities live there. The second, those chiefs rustlers have also what we call informant intermediary. They have also negotiator who negotiate everything for them. And then second thing, we have the distributors, the price negotiation, the third thing. So if once they get the cattle, they have people who distribute. The chain they use for distribution is mostly, the traders, the merchants who travel from northern Mali to Niger or Burkina Faso, or when they are in central Sahel, they can travel from Niger or Burkina Faso to even littoral coastal regions like Ghana, Benin, and Togo in order to buy. So the buyers are mostly also merchants from other countries like Niger, Burkina Faso, even in the littoral coast from Benin, Togo, and Ghana, who also deal with those merchants and traders who have already the trucks which can bring the cattle from central Sahel to the littoral coast, or from northern region of Mali to Niger and Burkina Faso. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the end of my presentation. What I can just say is that cattle rustling in central Sahel and northern region of Mali play a huge role in terms of conflict, in terms of inter-community conflict, because we know that in the central Mali area, there is an intra-community conflict between the Fulani who are herded and the Dogon communities. Some of the drivers of the conflict can be linked to the cattle rustling by ethnic-based militia in this area. So even in the region of Timbuktu, Gao, and Kidal, there are a lot of tension, a lot of a lot of conflict between the herders communities and then the armed groups and even terrorist groups. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Elhaj, and thank you for already establishing the link between cattle rustling as well as other criminal markets that we'll be discussing shortly. And so thank you for showing just how interconnected this criminal market is with other criminal markets within the region, but also showing the interconnectedness between the different illicit actors that are involved within these markets. And I think that's particularly important when we consider, when we start considering our policy responses to how we build resilience and also mitigate the harms that are posed by some of these illicit markets. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Liez, who will continue connecting this thread that has been established and delve deeper into kidnapping in northern Benin. Liez, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Elhaj, for a really, really interesting presentation there. So yeah, so as I mentioned before, kidnapping is one of the sort of accelerant markets in that it's strongly linked to conflict and instability, often both a symptom and a driver. Next slide, please. And recently, there has been a sort of an increased recognition of the role of illicit economies in conflict dynamics. And in the context of West Africa, specifically the Sahel, the intersection between criminality and violent extremism. Now, as violent extremist organizations in Burkina Faso, primarily JNIM, the Al-Qaeda affiliated group, extended their presence sort of further and further southwards, they essentially were able to use Burkina Faso as a springboard for expansion into the littoral states. There were sort of sporadic extremist attacks in the coastal states. So when I say coastal states, I mean Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, and Benin here, because Ghana has so far been spared. There were sporadic attacks between 2016 and 2020, but 2021 is the year that really marked the spillover of violent extremism from the Sahel into those coastal states. In Benin, as you can see from the map, the overwhelming majority of extremist violence is concentrated in Atakora and Alibori, which are the two northernmost regions, and in particular near the borders. So violent extremist organization presence in northern Benin is at the moment is far less entrenched than it is in the Sahelian states. And so armed attacks in Benin were largely carried out by militants who were actually based in Burkina Faso or Niger. And so border areas are particularly vulnerable to violence and insecurity. And armed groups of different types often use these border areas as bases from which military operations can be conducted, as well as sort of pools of potential recruits. And here specifically national parks and sort of national reserves are particularly relevant. And you can see those from the map that across from west to east, the northern border of Benin, there is this sort of the WAP complex, which is particularly relevant in conflict dynamics and illicit economy dynamics. I would say the last couple of years, the type of violence has evolved since the really early days of infiltration in sort of the end of 2021. I won't delve too much into the conflict dynamics here because I want to leave some time to speak more about the illicit economies. But one of the notable shifts was the sort of in 2022 was the emergence or the increased use of improvised explosive devices, for example. But in addition to the modus operandi changing, the targets of extremist violence have also changed to a degree in 2023. And you can see this in the pie charts at the bottom, whereas in 2022, VEO attacks were more or less evenly split between targeting civilians and targeting state forces, so military and other security forces. In 2023, more than 3/4 of VEO attacks were against civilians. And one form of this kind of violence against civilians is kidnapping. Next slide, please. Kidnapping of civilians has sort of generally followed more or less the same trend as violence against civilians more broadly, in terms of intensity, in terms of geography, because it's just one type of violence that VEOs use to sort of expand their reach in Atakor and Ali Bori departments. In 2019, before any extremist groups had ever claimed any attacks on Beninese soil, 2 French nationals were kidnapped in the Pinjai National Park, and their Beninese guide was killed. And this first kidnapping case, and when I say first kidnapping case attributed to violent extremists, provides quite an interesting insight, because just like in Burkina Faso and in Mali, it shows that kidnappings, as well as other illicit economies such as armed highway banditry, cattle rustling, as we've seen, vehicle thefts, and so on, these kind of illicit economies often operate as entry points for VEOs. In 2020 and 2021, kidnapping incidents remained fairly anecdotal, fairly sporadic, not noticeable, shall we say, in terms of the number. And for the vast majority were sort of unrelated actually to VEO activity. But in 2022, there were 23 separate incidents of kidnapping across the 2 northern departments. We've sort of, based on open source data and ACLED data, and our own fieldwork, we've sort of put together a database on kidnappings, and that's, there were 23 in 2022. But I cannot stress enough how hard it is to get accurate data on anything sort of in the sort of realm of illicit economies, not least kidnapping, due to its sort of inherently clandestine nature, right? So it goes underreported to such a large extent that this 23 figure is definitely undoubtedly a fairly significant undercount. So just bear that in mind when we're talking about figures. But so in 2022 there were 23 separate incidents. By mid-September 2023, that figure had almost doubled. So it was 44 numbers of kidnappings that were sort of attributed to violent extremist organizations. So here, Jenim, for the most part, Islamic State Sahel province, have also sort of have a presence in the northeast of the country, but it's less clear to what extent they're entrenched in Beninese territory at the moment. There's quite a clear divergence of geographies comparing violent extremist organization kidnapping and sort of non-VEO kidnappings. You can see that from the map here, that kidnappings carried out by VEOs tend to be located either close to, on the left, the Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso sort of tri-border area, or on the other side along the border with Niger, in the Ali Bori department. Contrast that to non-VEO kidnapping, which you can see on the map in the sort of the beige color. This tends to occur further south, primarily along the Ali Bori and Bogu borders with Nigeria, and Galale and Singbana are just 2 sort of notable hotspots. Next slide, please. So why do violent extremist groups carry out kidnappings? I think kidnapping is quite often thought of as basically just kidnap for ransom. So, a way of making money. But I'd be very clear not to say kidnap for ransom, because it's actually clear that in the Sahel and West Africa, in this context, that armed groups use kidnapping first and foremost as a tool of expansion and entrenchment, as a governance tool, and not as a means of financing. And I think that's really important here. Now, based on existing research that colleagues from the Global Initiative have done in Burkina Faso, and obviously our own fieldwork in northern Benin, we've identified these sort of three typologies of kidnapping used by violent extremists in northern Benin. The first is kidnapping for forced recruitment. This sort of took place in the earliest stages of extremist infiltration, before VEOs conducted large-scale attacks mainly against the security and defense forces, sort of while they were trying to keep a fairly low profile. And sort of one particularly common type of kidnapping under this typology can be described as what we call opportunistic kidnapping. This can be essentially, quite often, it's individuals who just happen to cross paths with members of the extremist groups. These individuals can then be kidnapped to avoid basically the extremists being exposed, to avoid them then going to the police or to the military and reporting them. This happens quite often in the national parks, in Penjai National Park and the W Park, because it largely targets Fulani herders that live in the bushes of the parks, as well as also sort of young men from surrounding communities that happen to be engaging in informal hunting or sort of informal, illegal poaching or informal fishing trips and so on. So informal illicit economies. And these, sort of touching on what I said before, these types of kidnappings often go unreported because the families of the victims, essentially, well, either because they think that the victims will be accused of being members of the extremist groups, or because the fact that they're engaging in illicit activity like poaching or illegal fishing, sometimes they are actually thought to be to blame for being sort of forcibly abducted by the jihadist groups. Now, the second reason VEOs may kidnap people is for intelligence gathering. And this is a tactic that's also used in Burkina Faso and Mali. Until a group has established enough influence and control over a community, and therefore having enough sort of intelligence that allows them to use targeted violence, and essentially that's what they want to be able to do. Their goal is to use targeted violence to achieve a degree of legitimacy and thus control over the community. Until that point, they quite often resort to forced abduction to gather intel on communities. And usually the people targeted are people who live in a particular area of interest to the groups, or that are known to have specific information of interest to the VEOs. And then finally, VEOs use kidnapping broadly as a way of shaping behavior of the communities, right? So this type of kidnapping can either be intimidatory to signal strength, and basically saying, we're the strongest actor here. We encourage you to work with us, or to join us even. Or it can be preventative, and when I say preventative, I mean punitive, right? So it's using punishment as a form of deterrence. Traditional and local authorities, so village chiefs, religious leaders such as imams or pastors, or anyone really who's influential or sort of occupies a strategic position within the community the group is trying to govern. These kinds of people are particularly vulnerable to kidnapping by the extremists. But so too are individuals who have sort of cut ties with the extremist groups. And what I mean by that is, for example, people who have been engaging with VEOs to provide food supplies or intelligence, but then don't wish to continue doing so, and sort of breach the agreement they have with the VEOs. So basically they're defecting. And, you know, we also found, I'm going to finish now, but just to conclude with one point, is that we found that VEOs generally don't tend to ask for ransom, and cases in which ransom payment was demanded are actually thought to be what's referred to as sort of grand banditisme, or banditry, so-called, you know, criminal kidnapping. And that involves, you know, different actors, different geographies, and different modus operandi, which I won't really go into here, but potentially we could discuss in the Q&A if needed. And I'll hand over back to you. Thank you, Rumbi.
Thank you so much, Liaz. And we have a couple of questions trickling in already, so looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Just a reminder again to everyone to please use the Q&A function if you have any questions. We will now move over to Dr. Gideon, who will present on artisanal and small-scale gold mining in West Africa. Gideon, over to you.
Thank you very much. And then kudos to Liz and then Hatch for laying the foundation. So I would want to discuss artisanal and then small-scale gold mining in West Africa, and then its intersection with conflict actors. I would also want you to refer you to our reports. The title is Beyond Blood, and then there are lots of publications that the Global Initiative has done on this subject. So just go to our website and then you find more information. So why artisanal and small-scale gold mining? The artisanal and small-scale gold mining in West Africa is largely informal. So because of that, it is very vulnerable to all forms of illicit activity. And then we are also seeing that from the literature that drugs and then minerals are the top two commodities that armed groups would usually want to use in financing their activities. So we are also seeing that in the literature, in a recent publication on Burkina Faso, that artisanal and small-scale gold mining, that is unlicensed or informal artisanal and small-scale gold mining, is increasing. Why? Because these terrorist groups or armed groups would usually want to take control of these sites, and then would want to take some form of taxes, or would want to take money in exchange for security for the local people, whilst agriculture is shrinking because people who would want to go to their farms are being terrorized and then all that. So that is the kind of connection between these two. The next slide, please. So the next slide is a map, and then on the map you see some wine colors, which represents battles and violence by rebel groups, political and identity militia, and then other external factors. You see yellow dots, which represent explosion and then remote violences. You see orange dots, which also represents remote violence. The blue represents violence against civilians. The cream color represents gold mining areas. And then this is also, and what we try to do is we try to map issues around conflicts with artisanal and small-scale gold mining areas in West Africa. So what we do find in Mali is that insecurity in Mali poses threats to Guinea's eastern border and then gold mining areas near Siguri. In Côte d'Ivoire, we are seeing that areas around the Como National Park, which is located close to the northeastern border of Côte d'Ivoire, is a vulnerable area. And then this place also has significant gold reserves. What we see is that the Ivorian side has also witnessed a series of attacks on military posts, particularly in Kafolo, Kolobogu, since the year 2020. And then what we are seeing is that the government has responded by strengthening civil surveillance, eviction actions, and efforts to combat illicit trafficking and gold panning in regions like Doropobuna and then the Como National Park area. Now, in the Laptagoma and then Kidal regions, this is an area which spans the tri-border area of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. There is escalating insecurity and then violence with jihadist groups gaining some form of prominence. What we see is that the region is not only a gold producing area, but also a current conflict zone. And then there is high levels of fragility, which is also partly due to corruption, poor economic development, state frustration, and then escalating community conflicts. This is creating an ideal environment for jihadist recruitment. And then we see that these groups also exploit the gold sector, generating some form of substantial revenue through taxing the mining activities and then gold trade, which happens over there. Now, in Burkina Faso, jihadist groups are reported to control gold sites in northern Burkina Faso, including areas like the northern town of Kusurugu. In northern Mali, several gold mining sites in the Kidal and Gao regions are reportedly under the control of elements within the CMA and then GNA. And then what they do is that they impose taxes on miners for access to various locations, and then also in exchange for security. Now, our current study on Ghana also raises some potential risks or some red flags that we need to discuss. In Ghana, there are some concerns around porous borders and weak community resilience, especially in the northern part of Ghana, which is contributing to some form of heightened fragility. And then we think that this presents opportunity for jihadist and criminal groups to exploit the gold sector in Ghana, especially in the Upper East region. Now, Ghanaian state officials are concerned that extremist groups may exploit the state of insecurity and attempt to fund their activities through Ghana's gold industry. There are also reports which indicates that there are some spillovers of extremist activity from the Sahel into areas around with Naba, Boko, and then the Nazinga forest, which is also on the Ghana, Burkina Faso, Togo border lines. And then interestingly, we see that financing of artisanal and small-scale gold mining operations, because the country does not have formal means of financing artisanal and small-scale gold minings, what happens is that the activity is also capital intensive. So they are open to all forms of money, including dirty money from everywhere. And then we see some links with gold traders who have some kind of sponsors from Burkina Faso. And then what happens is that when they extract the gold, process the gold, what happens is that the gold goes to Burkina Faso. So we see that kind of cross-border flows there. As Liz indicated, there is also there's also worsening security situation in West Africa. There are some rising attacks in coastal states. Ghana has been spared. So we feel that there would be some link there. Just recently, the National Security Minister of Ghana indicated that Ghana's national security strategy is being reviewed in order to make the gold sector unattractive to armed groups. So these are some red flags that we see. And then reports have also indicated that there are some presence of mining explosives which has been manufactured in Ghana. And then this has been discovered in jihadist camps in Burkina Faso. And then explosives are usually used in underground mining in order to break the rocks. So that is what I would want to say on the nexus between artisanal and then small-scale gold mining in West Africa, and then how it links with conflict actors. Thank you.
I think we may have lost our host. I don't know whether Rumbi, maybe her connection has gone. But I'm quite happy to move on to the sort of the Q&A section already. We've got a couple of questions in there. I think one of them is for me and one's probably for El Haj. So I guess while I'm already talking, I guess I'll take the first one. So there's a question on the monitor, the illicit economies and instability monitor that I mentioned. And the question is curious about how the relationship with instability is measured. Is it simply a correlation coefficient? Is the question. Now, essentially the illicit economies and instability monitor is a composite indicator, and it's made up of three sort of three pillars, three components, right? So the first one is violence and instability. And so this has indicators both of violence and of instability, but also factors that have been identified as drivers of instability and enablers of illicit economies. The second component is the crime conflict links. So this captures essentially what we're trying to capture, which is the relationship between illicit economies on the one hand and conflict and instability on the other. So this includes indicators such as, is gun manufacturing happening in the region, in the illicit hub? Are there illicit flows to conflict actors and so on? And then the third component is actually made up of two subcomponents. The third component is called accelerators. And it essentially, the first subcomponent is infrastructure. So it basically captures a hub's propensity to play a significant role in transnational flows, both licit and illicit, as a function of their geography and their trade infrastructure. And then the second subcomponent under the accelerators component is what we've called stress factors. So these are basically those conditions that could either exacerbate or be the so-called root causes of instability and illicit economies. And so the monitor is a score of 30 overall. And as I said, based on that score out of 30, each hub can then be grouped into one of the four different categories. So low, it scores below 10, medium is scores between 10 and 15, high, it scores between 15 and 20, and then very high for the ones above 20. The actual data itself is very it's a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data. So some of them are stuff like distance to a seaport, and that's literally just a calculation. Some of them are sort of expert-led assessments of the degree to which there are illicit flows flowing to conflict actors, for example, is an example of an indicator that's essentially scored by experts rather than being existing quantitative data. I think we have Rumbi back. Rumbi, I stole your role as moderator for a second while we lost you.
No problem. Thank you so much, Liaz, for taking that question. And it was directed to you. So really glad that you managed to pick that one up. We have a second question from Godfrey. And this one is targeted at El Haj, asking with regard to preventing cattle rustling, what efforts is the regional ECOWAS police body making in reducing this trend?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Oh, yeah. As you know, there is a lot of, critics on, the credibility of ECOWAS in the Sahel region of West Africa. And I feel like everybody knows that cattle rustling is linked to conflict, instability, and even finance, terrorist groups, armed groups, and organized crime actors in the Sahel region of West Africa. I think if ECOWAS can integrate in the stability and security pillar, the ECOWAS police, to reduce cattle rustling and cross-border activities such as joint patrol between different countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, mostly in border areas, because one of the most affected areas in terms of cattle rustling are border areas, because it's easy to conduct the activities in border areas and then move from one border to another one in order to transport the cattle to other countries, other regions. So if ECOWAS one day start, like the ECOWAS police start having this agenda to countering cattle rustling, it will be the game changer in Central Sahel region of West Africa. Maybe Dr. Gideon or Liaz can expand on my answer. Over to you.
Thank you so much, El Haj. Just before we move on to Liaz and Dr. Gideon, staying on this issue of international cooperative efforts, particularly in border areas, You mentioned this involvement of organized group and weak law enforcement, and you have started touching on that within your answer. But could you please elaborate on the international cooperative efforts and initiatives that have been taken in addition to the ECOWAS police to strengthen law enforcement and tackle cross-border cattle rustling networks in the Sahel region?
Oh, yeah, there is a lot of stabilization effort, as you know, since 2012, 2015 in the Sahel region, international cooperation stabilization efforts to counter violent extremism, to counter organized crime. But as I can say today, those efforts have been successful. As you know, in my country, in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, actually, there used to be the G5 Sahel initiative, but actually, we can't talk about anymore the G5 Sahel initiative. We are talking more about the coalition of the countries of the Liptako-Gourma areas. That means that international effort is not present actually because both those countries are under military scopes, and most of the international cooperation partners are not exactly actually working in international, cross-border cooperation. But saying that is that the future belongs to, international organizations, international cooperation, government who are interested working in terms of countering cattle rustling and then countering violent extremism, to work in terms of strengthening cross-border initiative with government, with states, so that the fight can be a reality. Over.
Thank you so much for that, Elhaj. And then just moving over quickly to Dr. Gideon, because this issue of cross-border, this issue of criminality within border areas has come up quite a lot, especially in everybody's presentation, if I must say. So this convergence of criminality within and convergence and concentration of criminality in border areas. So a question for you, Dr. Gideon, you did talk about cross-border gold smuggling as a common occurrence in West Africa that contributes to conflict financing. What are the key drivers behind this illicit flow of gold? And secondly, how is this illicit money transaction done, particularly in terms of artisanal gold mining?
Okay, thank you very much. So what we realize is that there are several drivers of gold smuggling. And then one of them is the weak border security in West Africa. And then that is facilitating a lot of trafficking issues related to cattle rustling, for instance. It's a function of weak border security. And what we also know is that there are differences in tax regimes and then export tariffs. So if someone has gold or is a miner in country A, and then the taxes that this miner would have to pay in order to get the gold out to export is higher in country A, and then B is lower, what is going to happen is that they are going to find ways of moving to country B in order to take advantage of the lower tariffs. We also see that there is also miners and then traders who would also want to take advantage of the differences in currency conversion rates. So for instance, the CFA in West Africa has largely been kind of stable and stronger than other currencies like the Ghana cedi. So what happens is that if a miner would if has the option of selling gold in Ghana for the Ghana cedi, and then is close to the border, and then can easily cross the border and then sell in safer, and then come do some kind of currency conversion and then get some benefits from the forex, it is something that they would also want to do. Also, we see that there is no formal financing mechanisms. So the banks, for instance, do not want to support financially, artisanal, small-scale gold mining, and then even the trade, because they see the sector as very risky. So what happens is that the miners and then the traders are open to all forms of dirty money from anywhere. And then once you need money, if money comes from anywhere, yes, you'll be willing. And then once the money comes from somewhere, the gold would have to go to that person. And then that becomes a red flag that we need to. So there are several of them. I don't know if time permits us. But what we are also seeing is that government policy is also triggering gold smuggling. Ghana, for instance, introduced a policy that is known as gold for oil. The idea is to ensure that gold is traded, is used as a kind of butter for oil, for petroleum products, in order to slow down the rate of increases in petroleum prices. And then because of that, all gold miners within Ghana would have to send to a government designated entity. But over time, what we are seeing is that this designated entity does not have capacity to buy all the gold that these miners do produce. So it is also creating the situation whereby these miners would want to go to other countries, Burkina Faso, Togo, in order to get, in order to sell. So these are my responses to the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon. And Godfrey, thank you for the question. If you want any more clarification, please do indicate within the Q&A function. But Dr. Gideon, thank you for bringing up the issue of state responses. And moving over to you, Liez, what do your findings on the dynamics of kidnapping mean for state responses to kidnapping, but also what do they mean to the spillover of violent extremism more broadly? And within your answer, if you could touch again on these international cooperative efforts that El Haj has also briefly touched upon, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question. So I think violent extremist behavior in northern Benin, from our findings, appears to share many similarities with their conduct in the Sahel in the early stages of expansion. So basically, when they're seeking to embed themselves in new geographies, armed actors employ kidnapping as a means of establishing themselves as the sort of perceived legitimate actor, earning, often by force, the support of local communities. And in fact, it's the support of local communities, be that via providing information, providing tacit support by refraining from collaborating with security services, or, as I think I touched on in my presentation, direct support by supplying fuel, food, other basic goods. Basically, this support of local communities is instrumental in the successful sort of implantation of violent extremist groups. And so that means that any state responses that are aimed at stemming, then eventually reversing the infiltration of armed extremists into Benin's territory, need to center around community behavior. Crucially, the Benin's military or Benin's government have put significant financial resources into the sort of the military response to the violent to the spillover of violent extremism. The Operation Mirador has deployed 3,000 military personnel. There's loads of new military bases being constructed. They're seeking funding from a wide range of international partners. Benin's government tends to prefer sort of bilateral cooperation, although they are part of the Accra Initiative. I think a caveat or an important point to note is that last year, the Benin government had signed a military cooperation agreement with with Niger, to be able to better tackle and coordinate their efforts against the spillover from across the Benin-Niger border. Now, in the light of the military coup in Niger that cooperate and sort of Benin's response in terms of their sort of public announcements on the coup leaders and on ECOWAS intervention and so on. The Niger, the new sort of transitional Niger government have sort of ended that military accord. So, you know, that it doesn't particularly bode well for the ability of the Northern Benin to sort of to stem that tide. But I think, as you know, aside from the sort of military intervention, which is necessary but not sufficient, what state responses need to do is they need to make a concerted effort to build relationships with local communities, you know, avoiding the stigmatization of certain communities, the Fulani particularly in northern Benin, and sort of investing in the north to be able to strengthen economic development and social, basically social integration. You know, in Côte d'Ivoire, they have been, you know, successful in sort of stemming the violent extremist threat for various reasons, but the main one is that they've actually implemented a sort of twin approach of, yes, military strengthening and enhancement in the north, but also very, very concerted effort and focus on economic development, social programs, sort of religious tolerance, and all of these kind of things that have basically resulted in comparatively positive perceptions of the state among local populations. And when there's that relationship, there is less incentive or less of a driver for local communities to be pushed towards alternative governance providers, i.e. the jihadist groups. So I'll leave it there and I'll pass back over.
Thanks so much, Liaz. And Elhaj, you wanted to expand on that, looking at the context in the Sahel?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Thanks, Liaz, for those brilliant points. Yeah, I just want to expand on the context on the Sahel. I feel like violent extremism development, we can take experience from the Sahel. As you know, what was the root causes of violent extremism in the Sahel? This in the Sahel region of West Africa, there is deficit to access to governance, deficit of sharing of natural resources, deficits of access of governance. So everywhere violent extremism go from Mali to Niger to Burkina Faso, even in the so-called tri-border area, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the Tako-Gourma area, where I conduct a lot of field research, is that violent extremism group use the same grievances in order to recruit from local populations in those parts of the world. So actually, the violent extremist group are talking about what they call in Arabic the hijra, the migration of violent extremism group to the coastal states, some coastal state and littoral coast. So I feel like the so-called solution, military solution, for me is not, the successful solution. It must be like a grassroots, community-based solution to counter violent extremism by providing social growth, socio-economic development opportunities for those communities. Because when violent extremism group settle in a place, they bring a new form of governance, a governance based on Sharia law. They provide to those grassroots communities access to justice that they don't used to get when they used to be under, the government democratic institution. So you see how, the deterioration, democracy backsliding, corruption play a huge role in terms of behavior change, social change, and the terrorist group use those grievances. So there is a need on really, approaching, the fight against violent extremism, not only on the lens of so-called military intervention, but it's more about the civilian side. What community leaders, what traditional mechanisms, systems exist for communities so that they can find solution, supporting the state, the regional bodies, the international organization to address those issues in the Sahel region of West Africa, as well as in the littoral and coastal state in Africa. Over.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alhaj. We are running out of time, but we do have a question from Adebayo. And if Gideon, you allow me to hand this one over to you. A question asking about why Africa, your thoughts on why Africa does not have a unified continental anti-money laundering legal framework like the one that is seen in the EU. Gideon, if you could answer that in 2 minutes only, please.
Okay, thank you very much. West African countries, they are doing something, but it is slow. So the Mano River Union, for instance, in a study that we were part of, the global initiative, the Mano River Union has done a baseline of a sort, trying to understand the typologies of money laundering. There was a convening around the research reports, and then the conclusion was that there needs to be some high-level political buy-in into the conclusions. And then there was this issue around how to harmonize fiscal regimes and then all that, which the participants at the events were not happy about. So it is still something that there needs to be high-level political buy-in. ECOWAS through GIABA is also trying to do something. They are producing typology reports, raising awareness, and then there is some kind of increasing collaboration between amongst financial intelligence units in West Africa. Though it has been slow, I think that some steps are being taken to address that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon, and thank you for sticking to the time. We have unfortunately come to the end of our session. I would like to extend a big thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their knowledge with us, but also to the attendees as well for engaging with the panelists, for sharing your questions within the Q&A function. And we do hope that the answers that have been provided are satisfactory. But you will note within the chat function that there have been several links that have been shared for onward reading and for you to continue engaging with the panelists within the areas of their expertise that they have shared today. So thank you, Gideon. Thank you, Liez. Thank you, Alhaj, for showing us not only how conflict exacerbates criminality, but also showing how conflict also serves a role in hindering states' ability to respond to criminality. And thank you for providing some examples of work that's being done by states to start responding to some of the challenges that they're facing with cattle rustling, with kidnappings, with artisanal gold mining. I think the signs are clear that there is a lot of work to be done. And so I think this is something that that is a conversation that is continuing, and I encourage all of you to continue engaging on these topics. So thank you so much again, everyone. Wishing you a good night, a good day, wherever you're based. Have a